So now we're going to pivot the conversation to water and sanitation in crisis. Crisis, whether it be natural disasters or conflict, can have grave implications for access to water and sanitation, whether it be damage to infrastructure or inability to access communities because of warring parties and conflict, as well as kind of operating within the climate crisis. So I am now going to welcome some experts to the stage who will talk about kind of the complexities of operating in some of the most difficult situations, as well as some of the strategies for doing this effectively. I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Koch, who serves as Senior Manager of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute, where she works to support environmental peace-building programs and the Institute's International Waters Program. And then I would like to welcome Stefania Giodini, who leads the team of water advisory and innovation at the Netherlands Red Cross. And joining us virtually is Nicole Hark, who is Mercy Corps' Deputy Country Director for Syria, overseeing program quality and implementation across Syria in humanitarian, early recovery, and peace-building sectors. And then I would also like to welcome Rolando Wallusche Saul, who is Water and Sanitation Humanitarian Team Lead at Catholic Relief Services. Thank you so much for joining us. And just as a note, so that our audience online can hear, if you can keep the microphone close when you respond. Thank you. So if we could start with Nicole, so you work on Syria. Can you talk about the recent earthquakes and how they impacted water and sanitation provision?
Sure, thanks for having me. So access to clean water was already sort of a challenge for for Northwest Syria before last month's earthquake. We had about 135,000 people that were already sort of solely relying on Mercy Corps' clean water distribution, but with the earthquake, even those water supplies were damaged. Mud and soil contaminated water supplies. We inspected the water infrastructure that we rely on, and over 20% is unusable and in need of repair. We certainly have been concerned also about wash services and significant needs for emergency latrines, as well as concerns in general over the water provisions, given that there was already a cholera outbreak since last fall, and concerns both in the reporting going down because of the earthquake, as well as, of course, the impact to health facilities and the ability to triangulate cholera cases that were rising as a result.
And what are you doing to kind of prepare for the months forward for serving these populations?
Specific to water post-earthquake, Mercy Corps is going to be working on water supply to newly out-of-shelter families and also areas where the most vulnerable can access water. So we've seen people move into collective shelters, into camp settings. We're focusing on trying to repair some of those boreholes that were damaged, as I mentioned, and looking at whether we can rehabilitate water stations. We're certainly aiming to increase water distribution levels as part of the broader efforts to combat cholera, looking at including more awareness sessions, hygiene kit distributions, trying to sort of bring back some of those supplies that people may have lost or been damaged as a result of the earthquake. And then, of course, we continue to provide solid waste management in 98 camps where we currently work, and we'll likely expand those services to additional camps and collective shelters based on population movement.
Thank you. And Rolando, so part of your portfolio includes countries that have experienced extreme weather like flooding in Nigeria, drought in Somalia, flooding in South Sudan. Can you talk about how this extreme weather has impacted sanitation systems?
Yes, thank you. Well, sanitation is a tricky one. It's always affected. And to simplify the question, I would say I would divide our target population in two groups: those that have some form of basic or sanitation, and those that doesn't. And the result is always a negative impact. You know, most of latrines or the sanitation systems get destroyed, and what we end up at the end of the day is with more people defecating in the open, So that's the problem. I would say.
And Elizabeth, can you talk a bit about water diplomacy? What is it, and what role does it play in crisis situations, and what sort of strategies do you think are most effective?
Absolutely. First of all, I hope everyone had a good World Water Day yesterday. We had a very exciting one in the Women in Water Diplomacy Network. And this morning I spent a lot of time speaking to young students, and they sucked a lot of my energy and really put me on the spot and shamed our generations for failure. So I come to you thinking that we have to do, of course, a lot better. Water diplomacy is part of that. We don't normally get a chance to also speak about water diplomacy in WASH forums, which is really, really great. One of our big problems is breaking apart these silos where we have water resources over here, crisis management, conflict, humanitarian response, and water diplomacy has an opportunity to cut across that. What we normally think of as backroom discussions between foreign policy, ministries of foreign policy, is a really old model of water diplomacy. Today we need really interactive, inclusive water diplomacy, and by that I mean bringing actors together from a variety of different perspectives, extremely inclusive, drawing upon the lessons of young people. In the Women in Water Diplomacy Network, of course, we're focused on including women in those discussions because traditionally water diplomacy discussions have been extremely exclusive. They do not reflect the participants or the societies they're meant to be finding solutions for. But today, we're pushing water diplomacy into the front room, involving media, involving faith-based leaders, involving civil society actors, and trying to leverage a real breadth of knowledge. Of course, keeping our formal decision makers and the foreign policy makers with us, hand in hand, but broadening up that dialogue to include a lot more perspectives. It can really be a part of building cooperation. It can help prevent conflicts. It builds resilience. And in a post-conflict or disaster situation, it can help us make sure we're dealing with all issues on the table. And I know, and my colleagues here in the room from the Women in Water Diplomacy Network who participate in these water negotiation processes, sanitation is hardly ever discussed. It's just not on the table. It's not one of the core issues at hand. It's not considered a high politic issue. And when people are more inclusive, they start putting those issues on the table. And I think that that's a really important aspect of this dialogue here today.
And why do you think it has been missing?
Oh, well, because it's an issue of vulnerable communities, let's say. It doesn't have a lot of power behind it. Some of the issues that the former Special Rapporteur Katarina Albuquerque mentioned earlier about the lack of power amongst the communities and the huge gap in bringing more resources to that. And there's a real breadth of reasons why it's not. Primarily, water diplomacy dialogues have focused on water allocation, quantity. Just recently, we're getting more into like quality issues. And so you can see we have a long way to go to widen the issues that need to be discussed and formulated as part of broad solutions to support our water future for everyone.
And turning to Stefania, so one of the big overarching themes of our conversations is like the system strengthening aspect. And in the crisis setting, one of the ways that plays out is ensuring that a humanitarian response is not a short-term response, but it evolves into a development response and kind of solutions that will serve these communities in the long term. I'm wondering, how can we do this? What do you think are the strategies to do this, and what role does kind of conversations with water and sanitation utilities early on in a crisis look like?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, that's a great question. So I work with the Red Cross, and we are famous for firefighting. So we come in emergency situations. So sustainability may not be the first thing that is thought about when you talk about Red Cross, but we do think about sustainability a lot. So the first key to sustainability is ownership. So every type of intervention, even immediately after a disaster, has to be co-designed and co-developed with the communities. Because without the ownership of the community, you are not going to have any sustainability. That's just a no-go. Without ownership, you don't go anywhere. In terms of working with mandated actors, development actors, that's something that is now a growing trend, something that we are trying to advocate it more and more in our responses. Specifically, the water utility is a very interesting one. So water utility have not been until now involved in emergency response, and it's something that is just should really happen. So when we come in emergency response and the water systems are not working anymore, so communities are without water, something that is done in emergency response is normally setting up like water emergency systems, water tracking, distributing bottled water. So these are like kind of life-saving activity that are fine for the first hours, but the involvement of actors that are mandated to actually give sustainable access to water is something that has to happen from the beginning. We do this not only in emergency, but we are actually doing this also in programmatic efforts. We have, for example, a very interesting pilot now in Ghana together with the water utility, in which we use the community engagement and energy promotion capability of the Red Cross together with the utility in Ghana, so to basically connect vulnerable communities, and it's called the Pro-Poor program from the utility, from the limited company in Ghana, basically making sure that not only these communities are prioritized and connected, but they also stay connected, that they know how to use the water and how to stay connected to the water. So there is a lot that we can do between humanitarian development, water utility, and this kind of activity needs to be increased. So we are huge advocate of that.
And turning back to Nicole, can you talk about the role that sanctions play in access to water and sanitation services, and kind of how do you provide these services to people living in kind of opposition-controlled areas, and kind of how has Mercy Corps managed kind of these challenges?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, honestly, I agree completely with what Stefania was saying about sort of the co-design and ownership. And unfortunately, that is one of the challenges that we face in the opposition-controlled areas of Northwest, because while donors were pretty quick after the earthquake to issue updates on sanctions, in reality, the revisions didn't actually provide much further clarity on rehabilitation efforts. And that continues to be a real gray space in these opposition-controlled areas, because in essence, in order to have more sustainable water access interventions, such as water stations or piped water compared to sort of emergency water trucking, you do have to have some entity to hand over to. You do have to have that viable, local utility or local community groups that can do the future operations and maintenance. And although, there have been past examples of NGOs working to create community water user groups or capacitate sort of local councils, in the long term, that has not been particularly viable in the Northwest. And so then you do have the Water Directorate stepping in, which is itself part of a sanctioned group. And so I think we do need, particularly in this instance, donors to reconsider not only what groups are still on the sanctions list, given sort of the passing of time and the shifting landscape of the conflict, but also to be more intentional in our discussions about early recovery and rehabilitation in light of the earthquake damage, but also because, we are moving past sort of the early stages of a humanitarian response and really into a protracted crisis. And we need to have more clarity of what are approved activities so that we can have sort of water access and provisions in a more sustainable manner for those communities.
Turning to Rolando, so one of the issues in crises are that there's migration of people from rural areas to urban centers because that's where they can maybe get provision of services. And so you have kind of this crowding of IDP camps in urban areas. I'm wondering if you can talk about what are some of the kind of decentralized solutions in urban areas for WASH. And then kind of, I've done a lot of reporting in Somalia, and one of the issues that I've heard quite over and over is that there's issues when people come to certain parts of an urban area, that land is owned by someone else, and so you can't build this permanent infrastructure that would provide water and sanitation. So can you talk about kind of what are some strategies around this?
Well, decentralized solutions are really interesting, especially in urban areas. And we have seen a lot of examples, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We recently did a study, it was published last year in December in Nigeria. And we are seeing more and more this informal water private sector, in which simply because the district or the government are not able to provide those services, private people, businessmen, drill their own boreholes in the compounds, and then they sell the water. And then a whole informal market systems of, not only the private borehole owners, but also pushcart sellers or donkey sellers that go with donkeys and sell them. We've seen this in Ethiopia, in Somalia, and Nigeria. And I'm pretty sure there are many other examples. So that's a form of decentralized system which exists, and I think that we need to start working with those. We're talking a lot about the private sector, so that's a private sector, even if informal. The issue of land rights is tricky, because I think, I don't know there is one solution, but I think that what we should be doing is working more with authorities or districts or municipalities in order to, for example, find public land in which we could, for example, establish fecal/treatment plants or any other wash facilities that are needed in an urban or peri-urban environment. So I think that could be that's my point.
Thank you. Elizabeth, so you mentioned in your first response kind of this need to ensure more women are integrated into decision making around WASH. How do we do that? What's the strategy for that?
Thanks for that question. There are so many great opportunities because there's so much better we can do in this realm. I'll elevate here the 4 R's of feminist foreign policy, which were the undermining foundations of the Women in Water Diplomacy Network and many other efforts around the world to bring women into the table in conflict mediation and negotiation processes. So that's understanding the reality. What are the reality of the different stakeholders in your community? What are the rights that they have? What are the legal policy directives that guide how people can own land and water tenure and be part of formal decision making? Representation, of course, and I'm not just talking about counting heads around a table, of course. We really want to look at influence, how different stakeholders are influencing dialogues together, make sure that empowerment. I loved the Secretary of State of Finland brought up yesterday in an event that we hosted at the UN Water Conference how empowerment is not something that is an individual's responsibility. You got to attack the structural inequalities at play to really enable empowerment across a broad sector of society. So representation, and the last one, which I think it can be only spoken of at great length, which is resources. Women face a lot of barriers to participate in water diplomacy dialogues, international policy events like the UN Water Conference here. I'm talking about money, I'm talking about political barriers, sponsorship, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm sure many of you saw the front page of the New York Times on the first day of the COP with the family picture, only 7 women, 117 men. We have a terribly long way to go to make sure these policy dialogues are inclusive. I looked back at some pictures of the first UN Water Conference, and there were a few women in the mix, including A former colleague of mine, Malin Faulkner, from the Stockholm International Water Institute, but very few. I mean, very, very few. We have so much further to go, and in making sure we're taking down those barriers and getting more women to the table.
And Stefania, can you talk about the role of early warning systems in water and sanitation related disasters?
Yes, so early warning system is one of the other big topics in this UN Water Conference. This morning there was the launch of the early warning system for all relaunch at the Water Conference of the initiative. So early warning system, they have, first of all, like the very, very straightforward of getting people out of danger, but there is more than that, actually. Early warning system, the process of setting up an early warning system is the process of cooperation between stakeholders. So disaster management, hydrometeorological institutes, all kind of water also related institution and ministry. So the idea of setting up an early warning system in itself is already a great process to ensure that that cooperation is present locally on the ground, because you cannot get that cooperation while a disaster is happening. So this is actually a very important role of early warning system. The other importance of early warning system, this specifically for the humanitarian intervention, is the ability of unlocking financing before a disaster. This was not happening before. So there is a lot in terms of early action that you can do before a disaster to alleviate suffering, to prevent some of the impact of water-related disasters, but you cannot do it if financing is not available. In order to do that, early warning system is what is needed for donors to unlock the disaster. So to have some evidence-based, let's say, information so that that financing is unlocked. So that are the two actually main impact of early warning system, beside, of course, when an early warning system is going to get as many people as possible out of danger, and not only people, but also their livelihood assets, because nobody wants to go back to a village without having any mean of livelihood.
Can you expand on that? You said kind of evidence-based, an evidence-based can unlock finance. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So what happens when you have an early warning system set up is that you need what is called a trigger. So something, basically a big red lamp that says disaster is coming. So you need to know a number of things. What is coming, more or less when it's coming, and what will be the impact. This sounds easy, it is not. So it's like having a crystal. If we were 100 years ago, we would have to have a crystal ball to know that. Well, now we can do something about it because we have satellites, we have data. So many of the climate-related disasters can actually be forecasted. A flood can be forecasted with enough certainty around 1 week before it's happening. For a drought, you can have early signs months before. So you have actually the time to set up early action, pre-agreed early action among those stakeholders that you are going to set around the table years and months before the early warning system is actually ready to activate. In this process, this trigger is going basically to just activate the red light, but not only, also to give out all those information, because with satellite data and also local data, we are able now to forecast where the disaster is happening, but also more or less how many people will be impacted, who will be most impacted, especially if we cross that with vulnerability and the risk data. We cannot do this, of course, alone. You need a lot of data, and you need a lot of organization to have this data ready. So at the moment, there are 3 key organizations that are working on having early warning system that can actually give this kind of information globally. This is the World Meteorological Organization in terms of satellite data and climate and weather data, UNDRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in terms of risk data, and the Red Cross for validating and having data at the local level so that the information that is coming can actually be translated in early action at the local level.
And turning to you, Nicole, so one of Mercy Corps' kind of foundations is kind of a focus on resilience building. And in protracted crises like in Syria, how do you build resilience in the WASH sector? And has it worked in Syria? Do you kind of see positive examples of kind of resilience building?
Yeah, it is definitely a challenge, but it is something that we do see some small measure of success. I mean, obviously, when you look at resilience, we're looking sort of across a number of different angles. So there's sort of the immediate humanitarian side in which it's basic service delivery, the provision for people to be able to cope, and that is very similar, I think, for what Mercy Corps is doing in the camps in which we work. But then more broadly, it does get to that question about management of water and communities' ability in order to identify solutions for themselves and then be able to respond and identify resources locally in the event of future shocks. And that is where we've seen some small success. I think there's certainly still more work that can be done. Investment in WASH has been relatively low and limited in recent years, and the needs are only increasing. So it is certainly something that I think, particularly in a region like the Middle East that is already quite drought prone, very scarce water resources. And then, of course, when you augment that with the conflict and hyperinflation locally and the economic crisis that we're facing in Syria, there's a lot of sort of competing demands and increased challenges. But I do think that there is the potential for us to not only build on the existing foundations, but be able to make investments that do lead to more sustainability and support communities to be more resilient in the future.
And Rolando, I'd like to get your perspective on kind of that same idea of how do you integrate resilience building to create long-term solutions in crises?
That's not an easy question. We have several problems, and I will talk from a humanitarian perspective. I think that resilience requires, as one of the previous speakers said, political will from the governments. That's crucial. But also from our organizations, what can we do? Well, most of our organizations are based on funds. So our donors, many of us think that our donors should help and invest more in preparedness. We know what the problems are. We know when the crisis will strike or natural catastrophes. They are recurrent ones, so we can map them. And we know where the WASH weaknesses in a specific area are. That's enough information for us to build a solid menu of options. And of course, we need to work with the local governments or the municipalities or the communities, but that needs to be in place. So I think it's a mixture of funding, preparedness, political will, and proper mapping exercises, like you were saying, early warning systems. So I think that is the solution. Then longer term, that's different. There we'll need to work with governments. We need to sort of like make new alliances. So that would be my answer.
Okay, great. Well, this is a very complex topic, but you guys did a great job at taking it on. So I appreciate your thoughts on all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.